We're back in Gospel of Mark looking at chapter 3, and we are moving into a turning point in chapter 8, where Jesus for the first time says that he's not only come as a servant, but he's come as a suffering servant. And in chapter 8 is when Peter says to Jesus, why are you doing this to yourself? Why would you want to turn yourself over to the Pharisees and the religious leaders and be persecuted by them and even killed? And at that point, Jesus tells him to get behind him, Satan, he actually says. And he tells him that he is seeing things from a human point of view rather than God's point of view. And that's really at the crux of this message. The sermon in a sentence is that by helping our families to see life from God's point of view, we can love them well even when their demands are in conflict with God's will for our lives. So I would encourage you as you lead your class to begin by wrestling with the question of how do we respond when perhaps family members, unchurched family members, as well as family members who are in Christ, are rubbed the wrong way by our commitment to Christ? Perhaps we're living in a way that's more simple that fits their taste. Maybe we've chosen to not pursue a promising career because we believe God's calling us to serve Him in a way that's going to be sacrificial. Perhaps the way we raise our children is going to raise questions in their minds because we're following a different set of norms. So I encourage you to think through with your class, how are they wrestling with how to follow Christ, especially when they're misunderstood? Because that's exactly what happens in chapter 3 of Mark. Jesus is at a place in his ministry where the crowds are overwhelming him, and he doesn't even have time to eat, and his family intervenes at this point. In fact, they make a statement in verse 21. They say he's out of his mind because things have gotten so out of control. So they show up to intervene, staging almost an intervention. And in doing so, Jesus is put in a rock and a hard place. What is he going to do? Go out to his family and close down the ministry and go back home and try to decompress from everything he's been going through? Or is he going to stick it out? Is he still going to press on with the call that he has? And he chooses to do just that. But in doing so, he's trying to help his family to understand God's point of view. And I'm going to be talking specifically in the text between his family's point of view and God's point of view in regard to the crowd, basic needs such as food and family. And I encourage you as a class to talk about and compare and contrast those. How God sees those things and how we see those things. How our families might see those things. And then I encourage you to wrestle with the question that Jesus really comes to at the end of this. He describes who his family is and says, my family is much broader than you would have imagined. It's not, my family is not just those who are related to me physically, my biological family, but those truly who do God's will. And later on, he mentions in Mark chapter 10, he says, I assure you that everyone who's given up house or brothers or sisters or mother or father, children or property, for my sake and for the good news, will receive now in return 100 times as many houses, brothers, sisters, mothers, children, and property, along with persecution. So Jesus comes to the point where he tells them, you know what? My family are those who do God's will. But along with that requires suffering, living in an upside-down way, a way that goes completely against our culture. And that's probably where our families have the worst trouble, is trying to understand why we would make choices that go opposed, perhaps, to what's best for our family from a worldly perspective. And the thing what I encourage you to wrestle with with your class is to maybe ask that question: how do we get in the habit then of actively praying for and cultivating relationships with unchurched family members and friends, so that they can be able to understand why we would choose to follow Christ and to suffer for Him. So that's the message for this week. I encourage you to take some time to wrestle with that.